Hello, everybody. Welcome on the Lights on Data show. Today, we're going to talk about LLMs and their impact on how companies use data. And to do so, we have two amazing guests with us today. We have Ryan Janssen. Welcome,
That's
Ryan.
me. Thank you
Yes,
so much,
that
George.
is
It's a
you.
pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here. And it's also just a quick aside, pleasure. I love doing these, but I especially love doing these with my fellow Western Canadians. Nice to do this with a friend from Van.
Oh, thank you. And we always knew that people from Edmonton were very welcoming. So thank you and friendly. Thank you. But yes, you are the co-founder and CEO of Zenlytic, and you have extensive experience in helping companies become more data-driven, really.
Absolutely.
And I also want to introduce Paul. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me. Excited to chat today.
Likewise. And you're also the co-founder at Zenlytic, but also the CTO. And
right.
you're just focusing on making business intelligence easier and more accessible to the whole organization using all the latest in AI capabilities.
Exactly right.
Welcome, guys.
Paul's really the brains behind the operation and the charm and the looks. I'm really just here for the ride.
I'll let you two debate on that one. From where I stand, I feel like you're both two very smart individuals, and we're very lucky to have you on the show and to address this wonderful topic. But first, I want to ask you about what's a fun hobby? What's a fun fact about yourself that you can share with the audience?
I live out in Colorado, and one of my main hobbies is rock climbing. I climb a lot, and luckily I live really close to being able to do that outdoors, which is a lot of fun.
And are you in Colorado because you love rock climbing, or the other way around?
In Colorado because I love rock climbing, actually. Ryan and I both used to live in New York, but once the pandemic hit, I decided to move out here to be closer to getting in the mountains.
Nice. I feel like so many people in tech and the data space, they live in Colorado and they love rock climbing. Great community to be around.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Ryan, what about you?
So I'll say one hobby that I really enjoy. I barely do hobbies these days. I have a child and I have a startup, and that's kind of 150% of my time. That's all I want to do. But if I have time for hobbies, I would say I'm a builder, even in my spare time. That's been my whole life. I've been like that. I started when I was a teenager. My dad and I used to restore old muscle cars, and we'd rebuild like old Mustangs and Corvettes and things like that. Tons of fun. These days, I don't have a garage and enough space to build cars. So I focus on smaller things. The latest thing that I've been enjoying is building keyboards, custom computer keyboards and stuff like that. I've been using my old electrical engineering chops from my undergrad to actually build these electronic doohickeys from scratch. So,
and Ryan, what you're just showing on the camera there, and for the listeners that can't see it, he just showed two pieces of a keyboard. Is that how it's a keyboard in process, or it's just how the keyboard looks? It's split in two.
Yeah, no, this one's fully baked. It's an ergonomic keyboard, so you have the two halves of it that you use. You just put each hand, and you can keep your hands farther apart instead of hunching over a really tiny keyboard. So it's more ergonomic that way. And the two halves talk over a little Bluetooth chip on
it. That's awesome. And okay, speaking of being a bit more ergonomic, I feel like LLMs, they're offering that support nowadays to us on how we work with data, how we interact with it. So in what ways do LLMs really enable new interfaces to data that kind of lower that barrier to obtaining those insights?
So I think there's two things here. The first one is that LLMs are both a new interface for data, but they're also in a way the oldest interface for data. The oldest interface for data is emailing someone and asking them about it. Right. And saying, hey, you person who has context on what goes on in data at this company, what is XYZ? Where can I find this? What is going on? And they'll either tell you, we don't track that, we don't have it at all, or we have it, it's over here, or what do you mean? Can you be more clear? These are some of the things that it looks like you're trying to ask about. And being able to handle all of those is the point that we've finally gotten to in LLMs. So now you can ask those same questions, the same questions you've been asking for a really long time of people on the data team. But instead of waiting days to get responses back, you can get responses back in seconds.
I love it. So in a way, we're going back to the basics, to what users are most comfortable with. And that's having that more human-like interaction and just asking questions and getting those answers back, and not really having to deal with all the technical aspects on how do I extract all that information out of the data that I have.
Yep, absolutely. And I'd say one of the other things that's really important about the way like our system specifically works is that the data team still has the ability to define complicated definitions. that we don't rely on the large language model to generate SQL or to define any of the things for the company. And that is actually crucial because these definitions, net revenue, like what does it mean to be an active user, these vary dramatically across companies, just depending on how the business functions. So you have to have the ability for business to say, this is how we're going to count active users. And that's going to be consistent across all the features we look at, or this is how we're going to count net revenue. And it's got to be consistent. That's the way we've done it for years. And we've got to keep reporting this way. So the LLM is able to use those definitions as opposed to just like guessing at its own thing, which is just unacceptable in a real business context.
And I think that's great. And it all starts with that metadata and making sure that you have those common definitions that you can refer to. But do you feel that companies need to worry about the challenge of hallucination with LLMs? In this case, would it come up with a new definition on its own if it's not already in its dictionary?
Yep. So that's a great question. And so the way it works now is it will only reference existing definitions. And it won't just come up with a new definition for you, which is for good and bad. If you don't have something defined, it won't surface it for you. But the thing that gets you is a guarantee that everything it's showing you has been looked at by the data team, is definitely correct, and that you can really trust the output. Yeah. So I would say in that, it's better for it to rely on those existing definitions. But watch the space. It will surely be generating the definitions and asking you if they're correct at some point.
To answer your question directly, George, yes, people should absolutely worry about hallucination in probably any LLM application. In particular, so I think that really manifests itself as a need for a human in the loop. And I just did a project for a friend. I helped them build a PowerPoint presentation using ChatGPT, and we put it in there. We got all the text, and it was a pretty good 80% draft of that presentation. But as humans, we had to go back and review that and make sure it's captured the intent and there's those changes to be made. I did it again with research and analyzing some of our own data at Zenlytic. I did a little Jupyter notebook using code interpreter, and that also wrote the Python pretty well, but I had to actually review the Python. So if you don't have a human in the loop, definitely is a big problem. An interesting thing about our approach is that we use the semantic layer to put that human in the loop in advance. A human has defined those metrics before the LLM is being used, and then the LLM uses that instead of having to write SQL itself. I would not trust an LLM to write SQL. I think because business intelligence is such a high precision application, it's very important. If you get an LLM to write a blog post and it delivers a goofy sentence somewhere in the middle, that's probably manageable. Or if you get a Midjourney to draw a picture and it's the wrong aspect ratio or something, that's probably manageable. But if you use an LLM for business intelligence purposes and they give you wrong numbers, that is absolutely not acceptable. And this is public company reporting, or it's financially compliant reporting, or HIPAA compliant reporting, whatever it is. You can't get those numbers wrong. So if you get an LLM to write SQL directly, one of the few things can happen. It'll be right 80% of the time. Some percentage of the time, it'll fail loudly, and it will just write bad SQL that won't compile, and you'll get a big error message or something like that. The scariest parts is when it fails silently, and then it compiles the wrong number, and you get a number that you think is correct, and you start relying on that and broadcasting that. And that's just catastrophic. I don't think that we're going to have the sort of fidelity in the foreseeable future to really trust an LLM with that SQL. Part of the reason is you can't even, the acid test for this, my litmus test for can an LLM do this is, can a human do this without any context first? And in this case, actually, if Paul was a data analyst and someone dropped him into a point blank snowflake that he'd never seen before and said, hey, tell us our churn rate, there's a pretty good chance that Paul would get it wrong as a human. So like asking an LLM to do that is even more likely to fail, potentially silently. This is all why it all comes together, basically. And the semantic layer plus the LLM combination takes that LLM writing away from the LLM and gives it to the semantic layer. All of that SQL is written using traditional closed form computing. It governs hallucination, so the LLM can't make up metrics. It governs SQL writing, so the LLM can't write bad SQL. And then all the computation, of course, happens in the warehouse, so the LLM can't do crazy math in its head because we know that they're bad at math. That particular workflow takes that out of the equation.
I love that you have that governance piece in there. I feel that's so important, especially in new technology like this one, Zenlytic as well. I feel that in this case, like you said, when it fails silently behind the scenes and you're not aware of it, if it fails a few times or even only once, it's enough for upper management to say, that's it, we're not proceeding with this any further. We lost all the trust. We're going back to our old stack of how we want to do things. Yeah, it's great that you thought of all of that.
one of the, I think, an important lesson for data teams everywhere. Have you ever seen the movie Interstellar? There's a lot of
Yeah.
Chris Nolan talk these days. When they talk about, they say they're going through the black hole or whatever, and they say we need to think about time as a resource, like fuel, and we have a limited amount of it. I think a good framework for data teams is to think of trust as a resource. You only get a couple of chances to break the trust of the end user before they'll stop using a tool. And if they see a dashboard with wonky numbers or something that doesn't match, or these numbers were different yesterday, is like the classic example. That's actually really bad because it's really hard to regain that trust after you've lost it. And this is not just for LLMs; it's a central theme for data and business intelligence everywhere. Is that trust is essentially number one. Trust and privacy come first.
Love it. I think that's going to be one of the top quotes out of this episode. Yeah. Treat trust as a resource. Love it. I want to just take a moment here and say hi to our audience as well that's joining us live. Hi, everybody. We have a Chris Tab here who's joining, I think, all the way from the UK, though he might be in New York right now as he travels quite a little bit. Hi, Brent. Good to see you there too. Chaitali and Ronald joining us from the Caribbean. And we are lucky to be there. And I wish I was there too. And Kingsley. And of course, we have Ravit. Hi, Ravit.
Awesome.
Good to see you, Ravit. And
Everyone.
Ravit has a question here. What would be the best way to incorporate LLMs in big enterprises?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the best way is to think about making sure that the outputs are auditable. This is something that Ryan's mentioned a little bit in what we just talked about. But the key thing here is whoever's using the LLM needs to be able to look at its outputs and verify that it's correct and change things if it's not. And that's really apparent if it's generating a blog post. Everyone, if you're generating a blog post in the language you can read, you're able to read it and audit it and say, oh, okay, I missed this sentence. It didn't quite get that concept the way I wanted it. I can change that. That's fine. If you're a programmer and you're using it to generate code, you are writing the code. You can look at it and say, okay, that's not quite what I wanted. I want to change that there. So if you're an enterprise looking to adopt large language models, you have to think whatever the output is, it's got to be auditable by the person consuming it. And that's why the text to SQL doesn't really work, right? Because text to SQL is great if you're someone literate in SQL who can review it, debug it, and change it. It just makes you faster. If you can't read the SQL, you can't audit it. When it makes a mistake, you won't know. So whatever the output is, whether it's something for your legal department, whether it's something like us to make data easier, whatever the end output is that it's generating, the person has to be able to audit that. So in our case, that's just we're using this metric with these filters over this time period. That sort of setup, that is what the user asked for. So then if the user, if they expected it to do it year to date and it's doing it just in the last month, that's abundantly clear and they can just click on the filter and change it. So if it makes a mistake, those mistakes are abundant and clear to the user and auditable by the person receiving them. So I'd say whatever your application, whatever your domain is, that's the key, is that the outputs are auditable by the person receiving them.
Yeah. And one other thing to add on deploying in big enterprises, this is true across companies, but it seems in our experience more common in big enterprises, is that there's lots of people right now that are worried about being left behind by AI and they want to do AI, but they don't really know what they want to do. I would say that the first place to start for an enterprise level deployment is the begin with the end. Start with the problems you're trying to solve and start with how you want to use the data. Start with the consumption. I think as a community, because we have all these shiny tools for processing data, workflows tend to start with the data and flow through to the use cases. I think that needs to be inverted, right? I think a successful data deployment start with how will you use this to make decisions? How will you change your actions if you have this data? What do you need here? What are you missing here? And understanding how the end users need to use that data first, and then deploy the tech to enable that, as opposed to saying, let's just add some AI. So begin with the end in mind is the name of the game.
Great. And Kingsley has a follow-up question on that one. And he's asking, what is the cost savings implications versus the traditional ways of managing data for the enterprise?
I think there's two axes here to pull on. The first one is just the straight up cost savings. The cost savings is just because data teams spend a huge amount of time now just answering these ad hoc questions. And that just takes up time from the business user asking the question. That takes up time from the data team having to answer that question. And that just costs the enterprise money. You've got to hire more people on both sides just to facilitate this very frictiony back and forth. That's not really good for anyone. But that's not even the most exciting part. The really exciting part is actually boosting the top line and driving growth. And you can drive growth through faster iteration. So if you're on the business team, you've got all the context about what you need to ask about. You know what you need to be able to do your job better, make decisions, target the right audiences. If it takes a long time to get those audiences, your speed of iteration is going to be lower. And that's what it looks like in most companies. It takes a long time, weeks, we're talking, to get the data you need to make key decisions, to move forward, to iterate faster. If you're able to get those responses in seconds from an LLM as opposed to weeks from a human, then your speed of iteration is going to be faster. You're going to be able to move faster and grow faster as a business. And that I would even say is the most exciting of those
100%.
two.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Paul. When I think about this, any LLM application or AI application, I think about it being a high leverage on one's time. So it's leveraging one's time basically to become more effective. And it's like that PowerPoint that I made. I was able to produce a good draft in 5 minutes instead of 5 hours, for instance. Excuse me. The data world use case for this is it's an incredibly high leverage on the data team's time, right? And the data team, instead of having to answer all these ad hoc questions over and over again and slightly different versions of this, which is time consuming, but also not really a super fun job to do, you can define those metrics once in a semantic layer. And then suddenly that scales you, right? That allows you to go and meet the needs of 10 times as many people because they can ask those questions automatically without needing your individual time for every single one of those. So it's the ultimate form of leverage on your time, really.
Thank you so much. And I feel already by having those savings, it's already lowering that barrier for self-serve and data analytics and decision making and everything. But that being said, does it change at all as who the users would be? Does it open it up for more, or does it still stick with those technical people?
No, that's a great question. And I'll just give an anecdote from one of our customers. They had about 40 seats on Tableau, and that was the quantity of people who were able to use Tableau. Once they moved to Zenlytic, they actually got 60 seats, grew the number of people who were able to use data in the organization by 50% because the interface is just easier. They can just come in and ask those snap questions without having to figure out what a measure and a dimension is in the Tableau interface. And they can just go and ask that and then get the answers they need. So I'd say absolutely that it's increasing the surface area of who's able to ask these questions about data.
That's wonderful. And okay, let's look at the other side of the coin. What are some of those potential risks or limitations associated with LLMs in terms of that data utilization, privacy, bias? What should organizations be on the watch for, and how can they really proactively address these issues?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Go ahead,
Also, the first thing comes to mind for that is there will always be questions that LLMs cannot answer, right? It's not a panacea that will answer every question in your organization. I think about how data teams spend their time in sort of three ways. The first is building and maintaining these tools. The second is these sort of ad hoc quick data pull requests. And the third is the more advanced analytics. And this is designing experiments and executing those and more significant sort of statistical analyses and things like that requires domain expertise and thoughtfulness and things like that. There will always be a place for humans to do that. And I would not ask an LLM to do that. And the great thing, though, about LLMs is they can take off that middle bucket, which is usually a substantial amount of time, and leave more vacancy and more availability to focus on those deep problems that matter.
And we have some follow-up questions here. And the first one comes from Bongani. And he's wondering, from the data privacy perspective, where does that data processed by the LLMs end up? Where does it get stored?
Yep. So this is really important. And this is part of how we've designed the application, right? So when you're actually asking those core questions, no data itself is getting sent to the LLM. All that's really happening is the LLM is able to look at your business context. Those are like the metric definitions. Those are like the descriptions. This is how we define net revenue. This is how we define active users. So it's only looking at the metadata. It's not actually looking at the data itself. And then we actually have in our interface, it's really nice to have the LLM actually look at the data and summarize it neatly for you. That's very convenient. But obviously, there's privacy concerns. If in any situation you're sending this data to the LLM, that might not be what you want. So we have an option in the interface where if you say, hey, don't summarize this for me, then there's no scenario in which we're sending any data to the LLM. So it's really, we put that decision in the user's hands. So there's a lot of times where it does make it a lot easier to use if you summarize it. And then there's other times where it's perfectly fine if it just retrieves all that data for you without ever touching the data itself.
That's great. So I think you've also answered Rob's question here, as he was wondering how can an organization protect its corporate data to ensure that the data involved in creating generative AI is not stored or processed on external third-party servers. So from what I understand, there's also that option to have it all in a closed-in system, and that you have control over that environment.
Yep. So like I said, we will have that little switch where you can basically say, don't send any data, don't send any summaries to like the LLM. And then the only data that the LLM will actually receive in that case is the metadata, just like the definitions, and never the actual like data itself.
Right. What about the type of questions that you can ask it? Do you have parameters on how you can configure that as to maybe not get all the answers that somebody would be looking for, but gated towards a specific direction, so to speak?
Yep, that's a great question. The way that gate works is it's really about what it's able to do. So first, it knows its limitations in SQL. So if someone asks for, hey, can you run a t-test comparing this and that? It's basically going to be like, I can't run a t-test as an aggregate function defined here, sorry. And that would be, like Ryan says, that goes in the realm of the more advanced analytics that we'd say the data team is still in charge of. And then the other things are things that are outside of the existing definitions. If someone's hasn't defined something, they're not measuring something yet, it won't guess at that and try to go and do it. It's actually aware enough of what definitions exist to be able to say, hey, sorry, it looks like we're not recording any data on this event yet. You can talk to your data team about tracking that or setting that up. So it's actually able to even redirect you in scenarios where the data doesn't exist to the person who could help you go and set up that tracking. Because a lot of the times the data just doesn't exist yet. It just isn't captured.
Very cool. Like if somebody would ask, like Susan here, hey, does he know when I'll ever meet Robbie Williams? If the data set doesn't include anything on that, he can't answer it. It would be like, cannot compute, ask something else.
Yep, that's right. And it's aware enough of its goal that if you do ask something that's not really related to your data, it will try to steer you back and be like, hey, I'm here to help with your data, not with your dating life.
I wanted Hal, but I got overruled. I can't let you do that, George. But unfortunately, they said that's too creepy.
That would be fun. Do you think that's one of the next steps, that we're going to get like a voice interface to it?
We already have a voice interface to it.
What?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's super cool. It's awesome, and a lot of people don't even realize it exists. But yeah, you can actually just ask it questions, and I think probably a majority of usage now, not exclusive, but a majority of usage is actually when we're demoing it. But super cool.
Wow. Okay, and can you choose a voice, or you have a specific voice that you've chosen?
Right now, there's only one option, but
Yeah.
that might be something we need to add.
Wow. Okay, yeah. I see like the comments already coming in. That is so cool. That is very
Front
cool.
door.
That is very cool.
This actually begs a really interesting discussion around like how LLMs should be used in user interfaces. And it's not a data problem specifically, but just generally, we're still in the top of the first for the application layer of these tools, right? There's just room to run. And I think of it like the early stages of any platform shift. First, people tend to adhere to the last generation's patterns, right? So people started making tiny websites for the iPhone when it came out. Or the classic example is like when trains first came out, they were made by horse and carriage drivers, and the trains looked like big strings of like horse and buggies, except without the horses. So we don't know what those new patterns are going to look like yet. No one's actually invented the train, and people are trying lots of different things. Chat is an obvious one, for instance. People are building chats into things. Sometimes maybe where there shouldn't be chats even. Sometimes people try and put the LLMs on Rails, and they prompt engineer a button to call an LLM and things like that, right? Some people have single questions, and there's lots of big question marks around how that should be deployed. I think we're actually lucky in that regard because we have such a shining North Star in the data industry that the end state for business intelligence for a long time has been a chat, right? It's like whenever you need more information than your dashboards can give you, it's like you go and ask a chat. Or if you can't figure out how to work the visual exploration tool, you go and chat with the data team. We have a nice North Star. We're fortunate in the sense that we have a goal of here's what a great data interaction looks like because we've been doing them for long before LLMs have existed.
That is so cool. And I encourage everybody to go check out zenlytic.com, get a demo, see how that works, and test out that verbal interface that you guys have too. That's really cool. Okay, looking ahead, what advice would you give to companies looking to leverage LLMs to optimize their use of data?
So I think one of the big ones is, whatever tools you're evaluating, just like I mentioned on that Auditability piece, just make sure that the people who are receiving this output have the ability to verify it. And the other thing I would say is that definitely don't be afraid to go deep in those sales calls on how the system is actually working, because you got to make sure that if it's a critical area, like data, legal, anything touching medical records, it's really critical to not make mistakes. And you've got to have a good understanding organizationally of just how does this product that we're evaluating work? And if this is a critical area, like how can we be absolutely confident that we're not going to get burned really badly here? So I would say definitely be willing to dive into the details of how the system's working.
Yeah. My big piece of advice in the general sense would be don't to be understand the reason why you're using the LLMs. So I would say don't use them to try and build something superhuman quality. So the same way that the Zoe chatbot won't run a t-test for you, but she'll answer a lot of data questions. I think people expect an LLM to write something that's more coherent and more poetic and more whatever than a human can do. Write a better marketing blog post than you could yourself. Uh, you have too much domain knowledge and expertise to do that, right? So it's hard for an LLM to do that a higher quality. What LLMs are very good at is that leverage on time. Higher automation leads to moving people faster and more effectively. So focus on use cases where you can increase velocity instead of increase quality, and let people just do the same things really fast and trying to build these super instead of trying to build superhuman things that people couldn't do otherwise.
Beautiful. And we have a question here from Twitter, or I should say X. But what is next for Zenlytic?
The next and arguably one of the coolest suites of features we have will be around helping the data team actually set up these metrics way faster. So right now, if you look at a tool like Looker, who has a strong semantic layer, it takes more work to set up, but you get a lot of benefit from it. I think long term, it's actually going to be a lot easier to set up semantic layer tools because LLMs are fantastic at generating text and based off what you tell them to do. Our next suite of features is going to be around making it really easy to set up the semantic layer, even easier than configuring a tool like Tableau where you're clicking on the interface. I would say our next suite of features is going to make it really just so simple to set up and manage a semantic layer.
Yeah, and that really is like one of the I tell people this is probably the biggest problem in the data industry right now, which is complexity, right? And we have these very flexible tools that are very powerful, but it's led to a situation where it's a full-time job to build and maintain these tools, right? And
Right.
even I know Coalesce, the theme this year is going to be managing complexity. And people think about Looker, they think, oh wow, that tool is so good to use, but it's so burdensome to go and write 5,000 line LookML deployments. And people are spending a lot of time on this, and I think this really is the biggest problem in data right now. We've seen really incredible applications of things like Copilot and Copilot X for engineering applications. I think there's lots of parallel opportunities in the data world.
Love it. And you're completely right. Complexity is definitely high. Just to be aware of the context and having all that semantics in place and understood. Like both of you said, it's hard enough for humans sometimes to figure all this out. Of course, it would be hard for LLMs, but we're getting there. And I think with tools like Zenlytic, we're just one step closer to that future that we want to be in. Thank you so much, Paul and Ryan, for putting the lights on LLMs and their impact on how companies use data. And it was a pleasure, very insightful.
Great. Thanks, George. Loved our
Thanks so much.
conversation.
Thanks so much for having us. Great chat.
Thanks, everyone. Happy weekend ahead.